I have a question. I feel like a couple years ago, the big thing was like, oh, pivot to video, pivot to video. Everyone's going to pivot to video. And I feel like audio had the potential for like taking over, like being the next big thing. And I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of like, is audio the future of media consumption, or is it like a completely separate thing from the written word that it just like fills a different need? Like what your thoughts are on its importance in storytelling.
I don't know. I don't know if I have that many thoughts on video. I've seen a lot of people do their podcast on video lately, and that like to me is so like not interesting. But I think that might just be because of the way that we consume things more so than it is about the medium itself. But this is me just like speculating. Because I listen to almost every podcast I listen to like while I'm moving, like while I'm on a run, while I'm walking, while I'm in the car, while I'm showering. I listen to a lot of podcasts while I shower. So, but I don't know. I've never really thought about video. I don't find it, this is maybe a little bit off topic, but like, I think you and I have even talked about this before where, I don't like audio when I'm doing an interview. Like I actually really hate it because I don't want to look the person in the eye. I really want to sit and think about what they're saying. It's almost like I want like a sensory deprivation where I'm like, I'm only taking in the words that you're saying. So I have to focus on them. Terry Gross from Fresh Air also actually prefers not to do her interviews in person. When you listen to Fresh Air, almost none of those interviews are in person.
I love her. The thing that I think has been really like at least difficult for me, like we, at Brewbound, we started doing a video series at the beginning of the pandemic called Frontlines. And you need to keep a pleasant face almost, or like, like you just need to be aware of what's happening. Cause I can get real bad RBF like real quick. So, and our visual, our like AV team has started doing like usually like it broadcasts in speaker view. So only the person who's talking can be seen, but they've recently realized that they can like splice things together so they can get like a panel view and like they'll cut to that. And I'll just be like, cause I'm like listening really hard. It's hard to have like Ashley, like you were saying, like taking notes. It's really hard to do that on camera at the same time. So I'm all for audio taking over from video. And I think, I don't really know that the pivot to video panned out as much as we all thought it would. But that class that I shared the link to, they do spend a lot of time in the course materials, and it's going to be, I think it'll be posted forever. So if you just feel like taking it, still up, but they talk about how smartphones really kind of made this happen. People always thought that radio was dead and it was just something that you listened to in the car. And it was just kind of there in the background. It wasn't really stuff that people were forging relationships with. And then podcasts happened. And then all of a sudden, audio storytelling was back and it was huge. So I think it's just that ability to do other things while you're doing it. Like I listen to books while I cook, like while I walk, like, I don't know, you can do a lot more with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was the death of Quibi.
Yeah.
Quibi just had bad timing.
They had many other problems, guys. Yeah. I wouldn't put audio as the problem with Quibi, but
who aren't familiar,
nobody asked for
this very heavily funded video platform that was basically made for commutes so that people can watch quick bites, 5 to 10-ish minutes of high level produced video content with big names that then launched right at the beginning of COVID. Whereas the thing that audio storytelling has had since, I don't know, forever, is that you can engage with it in whatever you're doing, whether it's around a campfire or in your ears while you're vacuuming. And so, especially right now where there seems to be an opportunity to create niches within these subsections, so, beer within arts and food or whatnot, that you can find your audience and do your storytelling perhaps in a way that somebody else isn't already. Beth, I'd love to throw a question of sorts back to you. You've done a lot of stuff on Instagram Live, which is combining all these things we're talking about. What have you found about that platform to be good or ideal, a successful way that you've kind of enjoyed that and seen it work?
Oh my gosh, I'm so honored to be asked a question. I find that it's really digestible. So the one thing that I do is, since March, I've been doing a live stream for the San Diego Brewers Guild. And what happens is every Wednesday, starting at 4 p.m. Pacific time, if you want to tune in, I have 4 10-minute slots with different people in and around San Diego craft beer. And so I think the time limit of that is very helpful. Like, people can jump in, people can jump out. It's very easy for people to know that it's happening because you're already on a social media channel. So it's extremely easy to promote it and still be on that same platform, as well as like when you're on it, like how many times a day would you check Instagram? Like, probably more than you think you actually do. And it's right there on top. Like, it's a very easy opt-in. So it's so easy for people to, it almost requires like no effort to listen to it. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to go to Apple or Spotify or like all of the, a million different things. It's just right there. And having it only be 10 minutes with each person, like 10 minutes can be a really long time, but when that's all you have for that person, like, you can kind of pack a lot in. I mean, yeah, the whole video thing, like, it kind of sucks because I do have to be like smiling and I wear makeup and, I have to make sure my don't have pit stains and stuff like that. Like, but it's, so that's maybe a negative, but at the same time, it's kind of cool. And, especially during the pandemic, because you can see inside people's houses and you can see inside breweries that you wouldn't normally. So I think being easily accessible and having a short time frame are two really good things that have helped make Instagram Live specifically kind of work for what I've been doing.
Beth, how do you balance like the incoming questions from the audience? Because as you saw me playing on Instagram Live the other day, like, that's really hard so I thought it'd be really funny to have several drinks and then make Italian rainbow cookies on Instagram Live as though I were on the Food Network, and I am not going to be on the Food Network anytime soon.
It was so good.
But Beth like joined and watched and participated. It made it really fun, awesome. Being like, oh, like we're like chatting now. But yeah, it's really fun. Difficult.
It's difficult. The thing with what I'm doing, because I'm doing it on behalf of like an organization, and luckily they kind of just let me do whatever I want. Like, I can say fuck, like they don't care. It's fine. They haven't told me I haven't had to ask forgiveness or permission for anything. But it's honestly, like, there's some people who have joined like almost every single week, and they'll ask like kind of stupid questions like, oh, if you had to fight a centaur or a ninja, like, which would you win or something? And I just like, it's super easy for me to just brush past those. But I think asking very specific questions that make people have kind of a long answer gives me a little bit of time to look at what people are saying. And then I can kind of pick and choose and be like, oh, that's something interesting. And that's something that we can like, that can be my next question. Or I can just be like, I have enough prepared. Like, I don't need to talk about this. So it kind of just takes practice. And I mean, let's be honest. I think like the average amount of people that are ever watching at a given time is like 20. So it's not like I'm just getting barraged by it, but it takes a little bit of practice, but also I think it's just, if you empower people to talk more than I'm talking, like as the host, then I can kind of multitask and hope that they don't notice that I'm like not making eye contact with them because I'm scrolling.
Does anybody else have any questions for Jess and Ashley?
I'll throw out one. Just how do you walk the line of talking to and reading to, where you write a script, and when you have a podcast, I mean, some podcasts, if you're listening to NPR, you are being read a script and you expect it. If you're doing a personal thing that's, not interview based, where it's conversational, you're going to say gonna, you're not going to say going to, you're going to say, like you won't write, in a script. So how do you kind of, or don't you think about that at all? How do you, versus like, what do you want the audience to feel? Am I reading something to you, or am I saying something to you? How do you balance that thinking, I guess? Ashley, why don't you start just.
Sure. So I'm someone who like needs a script. like flat out. And I know that about myself.
Me
So for me, I actually have to work backwards where I write a script and then I can riff if I have the script in front of me. But that's a very personal like mode of thinking. Again, I feel like half the people I work with are in this chat. We actually just did a Sightlines episode with Kate and Brian, which will come out tomorrow. And I was like, guys, you guys got to script this. And they were like, no, we're good. And they had like a very simple script. So like thinking about Brian kind of plays the Michael Barbaro character. I'm really excited for you guys to listen to this tomorrow now.
Great plug. I love it.
It's gonna be great. But Brian plays Michael Barbaro. He does exactly what he just said, where he's like, so let me get this straight. It's great. But they didn't script it. They had like just some bullet points and they're like, we talk all the time. So we know like what the other person kind of means when they say something. So they didn't script it at all. But we had to do a fair amount of takes. So that's another thing too, is you are almost always better the second, third, fourth time you say something. So even when I've worked with Brian in the past, I'm like, say exactly what you just said, but just do it again. And you never know what's going to happen. Once you're more familiar with that audio, you're like, oh, I can kind of riff on this, or I can play a little bit more with that. But I don't know, like I'm someone who needs a script, so I'll put that in there and then I can kind of play a little bit. But I've never found that I feel like people sound too scripted unless they go too fast. That's the only time where I'm like, oh, somebody's reading a script.
I write it the way I know I'm going to say it.
Mm-hmm.
So like I'll write the way that I talk. I obviously don't include things like and, but I will write gonna and maybe and all that stuff. Over the summer, we weren't really producing new podcast episodes. We were ripping audio from our video show, and then I would record a top to it and usually an outro. And like, it was really fun because I just got to play. One week I did a little bit on all the hard seltzer banners I saw fly over the beach. But sometimes we would include a bonus interview. Sometimes Justin and I would get together and break down either like the BA top 50 or 4th of July sales. So it was really like a cool experiment. And in the beginning, I always felt really bad about giving the audio team extra work. So I would try to do absolutely everything in one take. And I stressed myself the fuck out. Like, oh, it was awful. Like a dog would start barking or like garbage trucks would go by. And then I would actually say onto the recording, like, oh, sorry guys, I'll start again. Until somebody was like, this is why we all have jobs. Like you can.
Takes us literally 10 seconds to fix this. Don't worry about it. Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's literally just like hot tip, just snap into your microphone.
Right. Yeah.
There you go. And then just clap, make some sort of spike, because your engineer is not editing really for sound. They're editing based on what they see. Yeah. Exactly.
Good to know. Because usually when I screw up, then I'll like 3, 2, 1, and then keep talking. So
they'll see that too. They'll say, oh, it's a 3, 2, 1. Whatever it is, doesn't matter. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. You can notice it.
We actually have a question from Will
learning so much
editing specifically. So this ties into that great. He is interested with advice on editing in terms of technique or practice that makes your podcast episodes better. And Will, if you want to have a follow-up, feel free to chime in or put it in the chat box too. So editing techniques to make things sound better.
Well, definitely doing everything, expecting not to do everything in one take. Like you're going to mess up no matter what. Like there's no way that you can say a minute of text and not fuck it up. You're going to. So having some sort of technique that both you and your audio engineer understand. So at GBH, like our big thing is snapping or spiking the audio in some way, and then having the person start the entire sentence over, because you don't want to be mid-breath. That's another reason why I take notes pretty copiously and I'd say this to my guests too, before the top of any interview. I'm like, I am taking notes. If you mess up, if you didn't like the way that you said something, start over, and that's totally fine. And I will take that timestamp note. And those are the two things that have made my life a lot easier. Something I didn't mention, and this maybe kind of like ties into this theme, podcasting really makes you very self-aware of your own tics. So I say like constantly, and I listen to myself and I'm thinking, why am I saying like so much? And I think part of being good at audio is knowing yourself, which sounds like a really nebulous thing, but you don't have to contend with that when you're writing something. You don't have to contend with that when you're drawing something. But when you're physically saying words into a microphone, you really have to know, am I somebody who says, a lot? Am I somebody who really needs to think about a question before I ask it? Am I somebody who asks really long, complicated questions? So I need to write down my questions so that I know that I asked something that's super straightforward. There's a lot of really interesting self-reflection that comes. And I actually want to shout out Beth a little bit because she sounds so great on audio, but she prepares all of these questions. Like I've seen her prepare her questions for when she does interviews, and I'm like, but that's like a trait of like, oh, Beth knows that this is what she needs in order to get through this interview and touch on every point.
That is only because I've done so many Instagram lives where I'll ask questions and somebody will give like a 1-word answer, and I'm just like,
what next?
Okay, I need to have another question. So I have like easily 50% more questions than I need for any given interview, but it's just because I've been in that weird like dead state before. So
yeah, so I think both of those things are really important because it points out two ways to approach whatever this audio format may be. One, there is a level of muscle memory that happens just from doing these things. So for example, with you, Beth, you've done this enough times and you're also you've been doing the journalism game for enough amount of time, like you're happy to like jump in, how this goes to keep that flow going. Another part of this, so this is sort of my own bias and background too. So in another life, years ago, I was going to be a sports broadcaster. And the way that I would practice in between actual games was I would announce things. Whether if I'm watching something on TV, I'm watching a game in my head or out loud, I would be announcing that game just to get that muscle memory and practice. Or sometimes even if you're walking through the house, practicing these kinds of descriptive things that Ashley was talking about, where it might be something that's running in your head, but saying those things out loud, especially right now where interactions may be fewer in terms of these interview topics, just practicing you saying things out loud all the time is a way to maybe work around some of these likes, some of those tics that we all have to work on. My thing, which you might have noticed, is I'm taking pauses that kind of drag things out a little bit. And that's the way that I try to be mindful of what I'm doing, because I had to start doing that years ago in the ways that I was trying to say things out loud.
Something that's been really helpful as a tool at GBH that I've done, and I think I've even done it to Brian, is I transcribe all of our audio. I just do it in like an automatic transcriber because I don't necessarily need it to be specific. And I can visually show people how long their questions are. So that's super helpful for people to understand, like, so you started this question here and you ended the question here. And then you said a bunch of stuff in the middle that doesn't matter. And I will actually speak to the strength of Brian's interviewing lately. Like, you've done such an incredible job of like asking really simple questions that really open up your guest. I think at one interview, he just asked like, what makes us human? And it was so beautiful in that moment. And the person that you asked it to, I think was it Letitia Cook or?
Some version of that question for Letitia. I asked that as well to Lucius Wilson, some version of that as well. Yeah.
And it just like opened up the floor to really have like, you really don't know what people are going to say to that. But it was just nice to hear you just be really quiet and just ask this very simple question because it gave it so much weight.
Yeah, a spoiler alert for everybody here. 95% of the people in the beer industry don't expect us to ask questions like that. And that is such a superpower that you wield that they don't know. And you get incredible responses when you ask questions like that.
Going back to the Michael Barbaro analogy too, something that he does really well is he'll just ask, what happened next? Where does this story start for you? Can you tell me more? Like, just dead simple questions.
Brian, did you also see the British broadcaster who back in early COVID was calling like street action on the streets because there's no games to call. He was calling like, did anybody else see this guy Nick, I forget his last name, but he was just like 30-second clips. I think it was maybe TikTok, but he was like people crossing the street. He would be like, there goes the woman in the black coat. And he's followed by just like calling it out, like practicing. So what you were saying. I'm like, just calling out regular stuff as if you were calling it is an interesting technique, but it was really funny if you saw it.
I went to Syracuse, and I studied, magazine journalism, but there were broadcast majors all over the place. And we had, when I was in school, a pretty good basketball team. So sometimes you'd have like a broadcast kid near you in the stands with their recorder. And I just remember listening to one guy being like, okay, here's Mike Smith on the Providence team, and he is 6'5", and his favorite food is macaroni and cheese. And it's like, how do you know this? And I don't know if he does know that or not, but I was impressed. So that's like really hard.
It's helpful.
One thing that we have not talked about, Ashley, Jess, I want you both to talk about this, but I would welcome input from others too, is prep work. The amount of prep work that you do for an individual, a group, whether you're scripting out all of your questions or just making sure that you have enough in your mental savings bank that you can feel very adept in terms of shifting around in the conversation too. What do you guys recommend or sometimes do in terms of prep work before an interview?
Good one. I usually hit the brewery's social media, just see what they've been posting. And if applicable, and usually is, I go into the BA book, like the May, June issue of the New Brewer, just to check out what their volumes have been over the past few years, see if we can find any trends. Usually Google the person, see what pops up there. Usually stalk their LinkedIn, which sounds really nerdy, but can be really helpful. See if, and I also listen, if they've been on other podcasts, I'll listen to those if time allows and merits.
I try to do a fair amount of research on people. This is me adopting kind of the Terry Gross method, because what I admire a lot about Fresh Air is that she is prepared. Like, she's read every book that you've written, every movie you've seen, even if she only saw the first 15 minutes, like, you're still impressed. But I do try to read as much as I can from my guest. But I don't necessarily prepare as many questions. So I'll try to put them in buckets. Like, what are the 3 things I definitely want to hit on? And then I'll kind of structure things from there. But I try not to prepare too many questions. I try to almost always start with the same question and end on the same question. So I'll ask something like, I do a coffee podcast. Where does your coffee career start? Or what are your first memories of coffee? Because that usually evokes some sort of like childhood memories, and those are really exciting. And then at the very end, I almost always ask the question, what do you want people to know about you? Because that's really broad. And it might not be anything, and that's fine. I can just cut that part of the audio out, then we're done. But if they have something really interesting to say that I didn't think to ask them, which often happens, then I ended on this really beautiful note of something that they really wanted to share with people. So I try to be very exhaustive with my research before I interview somebody, but I don't necessarily have like pages and pages of notes. I always have my notebook with me though. I do want to go on the converse though. So for something like a reported story, I would do extensive research on it, especially if we've already done that research. So I'm going to reference the Johnny Garrett episode we did for Sightlines. We had done extensive research on that topic for Good Beer Hunting already. We had published multiple articles about SEBA and the UK tax laws. And at that point, really what we were trying to do is illustrate all of the work that Johnny had already done in the written work. So he was almost a little bit targeted with his questions. So his questions almost were like, I know what your answer is. I already know the answer, but I need you to actually physically say it. So those were like pretty exhaustively prepared.
We had a question from Ben Keene. Thank you, Jimmy, acting as proxy. Ben was curious of any pitfalls that you may have committed early on when conducting audio interviews that you noticed later on and presumably fixed.
So one thing that I struggle with is that I probably am too enthusiastic of an engaged listener. And as people talk, and most of the interviews that I conduct are recorded for my own written stories. And so I'll always be like, yeah, okay, yeah. Oh, wow, really interesting. That's so annoying. Like, for you to hear as the podcast listener, so it's really hard for me to stop. I know like the trope on the daily is that, thank you, Gerard, is that Michael Barbaro is always doing his like, And I like when he does that because one, it shows he's listening. Two, it reminds you that he's still there, but he's also serving as the listener. So he's reflecting back and highlighting the points that are interesting or things that make you think a little bit more. So I need to get more on the Barbaro train than on that, oh my God, wow, tell me more. Because that's not, no one needs that in the world.
I think Jess, to your point, that was probably the thing I struggled with the most, is that you want to respond to people. You really want to be like, yeah. Like, especially if they say something really great, like, yeah, nobody wants to fucking hear that. But I think when I think about Michael Barbaro doing it, who I'll refer to him like 100 times over, he's definitely scripting those. I'm gonna guess.
You think so? He's scripting his hmms?
Actually,
I think
he actually does two versions.
I'm so ready.
Which to me sounds organic, and one which definitely sounds scripted. So if you ever hear Michael Barbaro go, like that, it often comes from a place of some grander revelation from the reporter. But in the normal cadence of his conversation, the sounds like they've already figured out what they're gonna talk about beforehand.
Right. They practice that conversation. That's a conversation that is written down. Like, those conversations are not like, I'm just going to go ahead and say those conversations are scripts. Almost 90% of what you hear in podcast, if it's not an interview where the interviewer is asking questions of their guests and the guests can definitely not know what's going on, those are all scripted. 100%.
By the way, you can add that in anytime you want. You realize that, right? Any he's done in the history of the podcast, any editor can take and drop it in. We're like, we need a there. That's a note that a New York
rappers do this all the time. It's called ad libs.
Yeah, so trust me, that's not live all the time. His is probably the same that was recorded 3 months ago that they just dropped in because it sounds like it. So it becomes a trademark, and that's But to Jess's point, if you have editing, if you record it, you can do it in the interview to keep it going, but you can drop it out in post because as Ashley said, it's extremely annoying to listen to as a third-party listener, but as an engaged conversation, it works, but it doesn't, back to translating what works in audio podcasting, which what works in another interview, it doesn't work here, it works here. Totally. But editing, there's no reason to just drop all those out, keep how many you want, sometimes it may work and it's fine, but there's a fine line with that, Ashley, as you said, where it's just like, all right, 1 or 2 was enough, 10 was way too many, and yeah.
We've been recording this whole time because this has been great conversation and everyone's been super engaged. We still have some more questions, which I'm going to get to, as well as this thing that I said it was the best moment in an interview I've ever heard. I'm going to stop recording, however, and so people can stick around for however long they like.